America, land of the free, home of the brave, and also the world's biggest and best superpower. In fact, I bet you'd be hard-pressed to find another country as influential and powerful. I mean, we have 19 aircraft carriers, for goodness sakes. But how did America get to be the world superpower it is today? Well, the answer is in the past, and today we're going to find it. Welcome to the history of the United States. Partially. This is America. Well, pre-imperialism America. What do I mean by that? I mean, this is as far as the U.S. had advanced territory-wise. This was the continental United States, the original 48, and America was hungry for more. Our first taste of imperialism was Alaska, which we purchased from the Ruskies in 1867 by William Seward. Seward had wanted to buy Alaska before, but all his government buddies told him that that was a stupid dream and he should just give up on it. He then did what everyone does and ignored his friend, and went and bought Alaska, and it's a pretty good thing he did. First off, it gave us access to the Northern Pacific and the Aleutian Islands. This meant we no longer had to go through Canada to access colder waters. Second, it had gold, and everyone likes gold, so that drew a lot of settlers out, giving the territory a larger population, which would in turn lead to its application for statehood. It also had a lot of useful natural resources like lumber and coal. But America didn't really hop onto the empire train until one momentous event, the Spanish-American War. Not a lot really happened in the war. The USS Maine mysteriously blew up in Havana, Cuba, and so America blamed Spain, as one did in these times. Anyway, we declared war on the Spaniards, and we invaded Cuba. Former Secretary of the Navy and future President Teddy Roosevelt led his Rough Riders up San Juan Hill, and the Navy beat the crap out of the Spanish flotilla over in the Pacific outside Manila, capital of the Philippine Islands. The war was really short. Really, really short. And you may be asking, who cares? Well, I'll tell you. We got stuff, and if there's one thing America likes, it's stuff, and after we beat the Spaniards, we stole their islands in true imperialist fashion. The most surprising island we pilfered was Cuba. Yeah, Cuba. The U.S. had its eye on Cuba for a while, actually, because it has a lot of sugar plantations. Also, the natives were being oppressed by Spanish rule, but that was not as important than money. There was a big market for sugar back then, before we'd had to buy most of our sugar from Spain, but now we can supply ourselves for cheaper and also make some side cash, too. We gave Cuba freedom a little while later, but we made sure we still got some sugarcane on sale for a while. Another island we snatched was Puerto Rico. The almost state became an important part of American foreign policy, as it allowed us to base our fleet in a more central position, giving us, in effect, dominance over the Caribbean and the Indies. Puerto Rico is still U.S. territory today, and it is still debated on whether or not it should become the 51st state. The Philippines was perhaps the most significant addition to America's territories, and not just because they tried to revolt. For those of you who don't know, the Philippines is a group of islands in the Pacific Ocean quite close to China. This was important because America wasn't the only one creating empires. Britain, France, Russia, basically the major powers of the world, were all carving out spheres of influence. The US wanted to get in on this too, but they were limited by the fact that China was on the other side of the globe. You know what's not on the other side of the globe, though? The Philippines. And what's more important is that it has ports. Why do ports matter so much? The answer is simple. Trading and economics. Trading is important. It's how countries maintain relations, get what they need, and more importantly, provide income for their citizens. And by now, America had gone through a lot of changes. We had just finished the Industrial Revolution, and we had plenty of factories to pump out products by the millions. Products ran the entire system back then, and they still do today. Make enough products, you can create a monopoly on them, which in turn leads to you being able to make more factories, keep your monopoly, which creates jobs, which circulates money back into the economy, which creates un economy bueno. There was one problem that took several years to sort out, though. The jobs weren't so bueno. Hey, you there. Yeah, you. Are you tired of working long, dangerous hours for little pay that you're just going to spend on booze? Well, all that is about to change, because the progressive presidents are about to come to power. Yep, now you can unionize, get more money, and alcohol will be outlawed. Now carry on, citizen. The progressive era was all about progression. Great strides were made in areas like work environment. Workers now had shorter hours and the jobs were a little safer. Cleanliness, city slums were cleaned up, sewers became better, and fires became less and less common. Women's rights. Now women had the right to vote, got better pay, and shorter hours than men, beginning the road to some of women's greatest achievements. Efficiency. Assembly lines and scientific management reduced time spent doing unnecessary actions and ramped up production and allowed for easier work. Regulation of business. Trustbusters like Teddy Roosevelt broke up the monopolies and trusts that were smothering small business. Just imagine if Steve Jobs had started Apple after moving out of his garage, only to be bought up by a larger corporation. Now that can't happen thanks to the progressive presidents. They also got rid of child labor and made the food market safe. All of this compiled into an economic giant capable of not only surviving but dominating the world's largest war up to this point, World War I. The build-up and early years of the Great War are confusing to say the least, so here's a short version to get us to the point of American intervention. Basically, Austria-Hungary had taken over some territory in the Balkans, including part of Serbia. Serbia didn't like this, so some of the people revolted, and one of their revolutionaries actually managed to shoot Archduke Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria-Hungary was understandably mad, and forced a bunch of unreasonable terms on Serbia to exact revenge, or else they would declare war. Serbia didn't want to accept these terms, and Russia told Austria to leave his little buddy alone, or else. Germany then told Russia to stop threatening his pal, which caused France to ask Germany to get away from his friend. Anyway, none of the threatening did any good, and World War I began. Germany wanted to knock France out fast, so they initiated the Schlieffen Plan, but the British intervened on Belgium's behalf, and Germany got bogged down. The West Front then became static, dominated by the classic trench warfare, and in the East, Russia's Socialist Revolution closed down that front. The situation was as follows. Britain and France have stopped the German advance, but they can't decide on whether or not to attack or just stay put. Germany didn't have a plan B, so now they're just waiting. Russia is fighting itself and losing. Austria-Hungary is also losing to a country like a third of its size, and oh yeah, Italy's there too, but they're just deploying troops with no real goal. Enter America. We had just been passively observing Europe destroy itself on the sidelines. At least that's what we told everyone. In reality, we were shipping arms and aid to Britain and France. The Germans didn't like that very much, so they told America they would use unrestricted submarine warfare. Things came to a head when a German U-boat sunk the Lusitania, a passenger ship. Americans were outraged, even though the newspapers contained a warning about the dangers. War wasn't declared until later, though, when the Zimmermann Note was mysteriously found by the British. It outlined a German-Mexican agreement that if Mexico helped Germany by attacking the U.S., they would get to take some of the territory, and as such, President Wilson declared war on April 2, 1917. Almost immediately, American power began to tip the scale. Our factories belted out rifles, bullets, artillery, planes, armored cars, later tanks, bandages, supplies, the list goes on and on. Once we got boots on the ground, we also made a big change in both the Western Front and the history of warfare itself. We didn't play by the rules. By the time America entered, it was standard practice to just wait in your trench for the enemy to rush yours, and then you just mow them down with your machine gun fire. And if that didn't work, then it didn't matter, because they only took about 30 yards at a time. America believed this was stupid, and rightly so. They knew that to win the war, you actually had to fight, you had to advance and push. Also, Americans were a little more prepared for modern warfare than their European counterparts, as they already had experience in the Spanish-American War and all the way back in the Civil War that allowed them to see the battlefield in a different light. They also had a strategy that was drastically different from the Allies or the Central Powers. Always advance. We wouldn't be satisfied with only gaining 30 yards for a week's worth of bombardment and assaults. We wanted 30 miles. In the end, our rapid mobilization, massive industry, and courage on the battlefield led us to victory in November 1918, a little over 18 months since we entered. We had pushed the Germans out of France and Belgium and back into their homeland when on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, peace was declared. The war was over, but America still had some work to do. By the end of the war, the Big Four, the U.S., Great Britain, France, and Italy, were already deciding on how they wanted the peace treaty to look like. Wilson, representing the U.S., wanted his 14 points, which would in effect provide America all its foreign policy goals at the time, with points like freedom of the seas, descaling armaments, and the right for native people to decide how they are governed. It also called for the formation of the League of Nations. Britain and France disagreed on these points, and instead wanted to punish Germany for starting the war, in their opinion. They railroaded their opinions into the treaty, called the Treaty of Versailles, and the result crippled Germany. It mandated that Germany must have an army of less than 100,000. It lost one of its most valuable areas to France, and also had to pay a couple $1 million to the Allies for damages. Along with shackling Germany, the treaty also took away territory from Russia, forming the nations of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. This took away some of Russia's only warm water ports. Austria-Hungary became Austria and Hungary, and both it and Germany lost all their colonies. The League of Nations was also formed, and it was one of the only things in Wilson's 14 points to make it into the document. But upon returning to Congress, they voted not to join the League of Nations. Thus, the U.S. will stay out of the very world order they had created. But overall, things were good in America. The doughboys were home, and the stocks were rising. It was time for some well-earned vacation days. The Great War was pretty short for America. We had troops in Europe for a little over 18 months, but that was enough for a lot of veterans. They came back and wanted to forget the battlefield and go back to working on factories or in farms. And now was a great time to do it. World War I had created an economic high. Factories had big government contracts, and plenty of people wanted to buy their products, so the money flowed freely. This was the Roaring Twenties. The 20s was a result of the Progressive Era. Businesses were booming now that there weren't any trusts to buy them up, and workers had tolerable conditions. Women were starting to get equal rights, and cities for the most part were getting cleaner. But it wasn't a utopia. We still had problems. The big ones being organized crime and racial prejudice, as African Americans were still segregated by community, and they didn't have equal rights and wouldn't for another 40 years. Another key point was veterans returning home from the war with PTSD or disabilities like amputated legs or arms, chemical poisoning, etc. And we didn't really have a system set up to help them yet. But overall, things were looking pretty good. The arts flourished, especially in Harlem, becoming known as the Harlem Renaissance. Many African Americans became famous during this time, like musician Louis Armstrong or poet Langston Hughes. The Renaissance became a source of cultural pride for blacks, and it led to the rise of jazz and poetry throughout the country. Another big thing was Prohibition. Needless to say, this was pretty unpopular, and a lot of people got around it by brewing their own spirits, visiting speakeasies, or buying it off the black market. In fact, because of Prohibition, organized crime soared, with gangsters like Al Capone becoming extremely wealthy. It's because of this unpopularity, Prohibition was repealed in 1933. For all the apparent growth, however, there was a hidden problem. This problem was credit. For the majority of the 20s, people were buying everything on credit. If you don't know, credit is basically an IOU. The problem is that investors and banks were using credits on the stock market. This changed when the stock market crashed on Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929. People lost faith in banks and businesses and went bankrupt. Unemployment soared. But what caused the market to drop? Well, in a way, World War I. During the war, farmers out in the Midwest were contracted by the government to produce huge harvests to supply the military, and after the war, farmers never really scaled down production. Eventually, too many crops were sitting on the market, causing investors to want to sell their stocks in agriculture. Unfortunately, the banks wouldn't give them any more credit to buy stocks. The sudden mass of people trying to sell and not buy caused the stocks to go down, causing the collapse of the 20s golden age. The Great Depression was probably the darkest time in American history when we weren't at war. Unemployment reached 25%, and I'll admit, when I first heard that number, I thought that was pretty low. When I pictured the Depression, I saw a number more like 50% or 75%. But 25 was a lot. That's around 15 million people who were jobless. People couldn't pay off credit debts, and many became homeless. Slums sprang up outside every big city. Houses were made of anything people could get their hands on. Remember all that food the farmers had? Well, they decided to burn it to make the value go up. Meanwhile, the homeless and jobless in the cities were starving. Soup kitchens and other humanitarian aid stations would have lines stretching around the block. Farmers didn't get off the hook either. In a very ironic twist, all the farming done in the West caused a massive dust storm called the Dust Bowl. This blew across the nation and even hit New York City. So what did the government do about it? Nothing, sort of. Before FDR, who we'll talk about in a little bit, there was President Herbert Hoover. Hoover was the last president of what was called Republican ascendancy, following the Republican presidents Calvin Coolidge and Warren G. Harding. Their administrations didn't do much, and if they did do anything, it was to reverse the effects of the progressive era by deregulating business. Hoover tried to keep his term in line with his predecessors, but the Depression made that impossible. A believer that government and business shouldn't mix, Hoover did little to ease up the effects of the crash. He was pretty unpopular, and in fact, Franklin Roosevelt ran a smudge campaign against him in the next election, saying that he was at fault for the Depression, which he wasn't. The most notable thing he did was begin construction on the Hoover Dam, which did provide some jobs and also set up an electric system still in use today. So if the Great Depression was so bad, how did we get out of it? Well, truthfully, we didn't get out of it until World War II, but we were on our way to recovery thanks to the New Deal and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okay, so how did one guy beat the Depression? Well, the answer is regulation and government intervention. FDR decided to finish what his cousin Teddy started and then some. He's probably the most responsible person for why the government is so involved in our everyday life, creating social welfare, several committees and boards, and passing what is likely 4 fourths worth of legislature. He created local government-funded projects so men could actually provide for their families, and also restructured the banking system so that hopefully nothing of this magnitude would never happen again. Here are some major pieces of the New Deal. The Federal Housing Administration provided house mortgages for the homeless and the poor. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration and the Social Security Act provided welfare and money for the jobless. The Civilian Conservation Corps provided jobs for young men to support their families. The National Recovery Administration helped various industries to regain their footing. The Works Progress Administration created even more quick jobs. The Federal Securities Act required corporations to give complete information on their stocks and also regulated the stock market. And the Glass-Steagall Act gave people insurance on their bank accounts, allowing people to put their faith back into banks. The New Deal helped restore confidence in the American stock market. Things were returning to normalcy, albeit slowly. The Depression was one of the longest and darkest areas of our history, lasting from 1929 till around 1940. Roosevelt's reforms helped put us on the road to recovery, but it wasn't until World War II that we actually left our economic slump. So how did World War II come about? Easy, we all know that. Hitler invaded Poland. But how did Hitler come to power? The answer is post-World War I politics. The Treaty of Versailles was really a mess, and the only people who gained stuff out of it was Britain and France, but everyone else was either not affected or hurt in some way. It also created a perfect pressure system in Germany. Following the defeat of the Kaiser, Germany became a democratic republic, the Weimar Republic, and it lasted until 1933 when Hitler came to power. Fate really set it up to fail, as the new government had to deal with all the problems of setting up a new government, plus all the Versailles Treaty stuff, including the War Guild Clause, and the Great Depression on top. As such, Germany really suffered. Inflation caused money to be worthless, and German pride was low. This allowed many extremist groups to come to power, such as communist and fascist parties. One such party was the National Socialist Party, or Nazi Party. It was led by Adolf Hitler, a veteran of World War I, and it quickly gained momentum due to his fiery oratory and talk of building up German pride. It gained such a following that Hitler was elected to chancellery in 1933, and he promptly outlawed all other political parties. Hitler actually did a lot to fix Germany's economy. He built the Autobahn, and due to secret rearmament, factories could hire more and more people. The army also swelled way past the 100,000 limit. Hitler also rebuilt Germany. He added Austria, the Sudetenland, and Czechoslovakia to Germany before attacking Poland in the fall of 1939. And in fact, it was these additions that caused Britain and France to take a hard line when he invaded Poland. There was one more major point that allowed the Germans to confidently start the war. Hitler and Stalin signed a non-aggression pact in August 1939, making sure that Germany wouldn't fight a two-war front again. All this culminated in the perfect storm for shattering world peace. Now, in America, World War II is usually thought of as starting in 1941 with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and that is technically true, because that's when we were no longer neutral. But really, World War II started back on September 1st, 1939, when Hitler's Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3rd, and Britain's provinces, i.e. Canada, Australia, India, all followed. Once the Third Reich had finished their conquest of Poland, they turned their armies west and just sat there, having to stare off with the French troops sitting in their Maginot Line, while the Germans sat in their own Siegfried Line. This became known as the Phoney War, and it lasted for the rest of 1939 until June of 1940. It was then that the Germans began their assault on France. Again, they went through neutral Belgium, but this time the plan was different. Instead of using the outdated Schlieffen plan, Hitler had his commanders use a new strategy that really captured the essence of Blitzkrieg. They sent a bulk of their panzer divisions through the Ardennes forest, while all the while baiting the British Expeditionary Force and the French armies into leaving their lines and advancing. Then the panzers left out of the Ardennes created a giant pocket around the Allies, and trapping them and forcing the surrender of several armies in the process. The British and a few French units barely escaped at Dunkirk due to fierce rearguard action and Hitler's own stupidity, and France fell a few days later. Now Hitler turned his wrath on the British. He knew he would have to force them into submission before the Empire could mobilize, or else he would be in a tight spot. But Britain had a unique advantage that had protected them throughout history. It was an island. Hitler's war machine would have to cross over the English Channel, secure a beachhead, and then move to subdue every town, city, and hamlet it came across. There was actually a plan drawn up for this called Operation Sea Lion, but Hitler never put it into action because of one thing: air superiority. By August 1940, France had surrendered and was now under the Vichy regime, a Nazi puppet. Because of this, Erwin Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was able to launch airstrikes on the British Isles from closer air bases. Göring had about 5 air fleets able to attack by August. What followed became known as the Battle of Britain. For several days in 1940, the German and British air forces grappled for command of the skies, with most battles staying away from civilian populations and just over military airfields and depots. Despite being outnumbered by about 3 to 1, the Royal Air Force held its ground and postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The Luftwaffe then turned to bombing cities in hopes of forcing the British to surrender due to mass civilian casualties, the same tactic later used by the Allies, but this too failed, mainly because Germany lacked heavy bombers. By the time America entered the war, the Battle of Britain was over, and the British were launching bomber raids over Germany, something Hitler said would never happen. Just like in World War I, America wasn't just sitting on the sidelines watching. Instead, we were lending huge amounts of material support over to Britain due to the Lend-Lease Act, signed in August 1941. This said that we would help Britain and the Soviet Union, which was crumbling under the effects of Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, as long as British ships were used to transport it. We did not want a repeat of World War I, where we lost innocents due to submarine warfare. We sent over food, medical supplies, rifles, bullets, tanks, and we even traded 50 destroyers for Navy bases in Greenland and Iceland. All this support helped keep our allies fighting, even if we weren't technically in the war. We also began an oil embargo on Japan in response to their actions in China, which had been going on since 1933. Japan was allied with Germany, forming the Axis alliance along with Italy, Finland, and a few other small countries. By December, Japan had finally had enough of America's public support of the Allies, and feeling America was going to join the war anyway, launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, severely crippling our Pacific fleet and simultaneously attacking our island outposts all throughout the Pacific. America entered the war a few days later. Throughout the early days of 1942, America mobilized. We had had a relatively small army with mostly outdated equipment and almost no tanks or air force compared to Britain and Germany. This changed in a matter of months. Our military was in fighting shape by November, and our Navy had already struck some blows on the Imperial Japanese Navy at Midway and Coral Sea, and the Marines had already launched their first seaborne landing of the war at Guadalcanal. The Army was still relatively untested, however, and all this changed with Operation Torch in November 1942. This was intended to corner Rommel and the Nazis in North Africa along with the Vichy French, and allow for a second front to be open to relieve some pressure off the Soviet Union. The invasion was a success, and after many hard battles, they, along with the British Eighth Army, pushed the Germans out of Africa. By September 1943, the Army had launched an invasion of Italy, but it was stalled shortly after. Preparations soon started on Operation Overlord, the invasion of German-occupied France, which was launched on June 6, 1944. It was the largest amphibious landing in history. By May 1945, the Soviet Red Army was in Berlin, and Germany surrendered on May 8th. The Pacific Theater continued until September, with the biggest fights at Okinawa, April through June, and Iwo Jima, February through March. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August finally led to the surrender of the Japanese Empire on the battleship Missouri on September 2, 1945. World War II was finally over, but the world wasn't safe. The USSR had taken over Eastern Europe, and now the United States was tasked with stopping the spread of communism. This became the Cold War, but the Cold War never would have happened if it weren't for the economic, territorial, and military growth of the late 1800s to the mid-1900s that turned America into a superpower. From the purchase of Alaska to the Normandy landings, the U.S.'s history has been one of adversity and triumph. It is truly one of the most unique histories in the world, and one of the most inspiring. Thank you all so much for watching. This is my first video, so if you liked it and you want to see more, or if there's things you'd like me to change, let me know in the comments. And if I got any facts wrong, tell me. Or if you're my history teacher, just put it in my rubric.